Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from the Humanities Teaching app Noetic, and we are back with Robert Schut. We have another installment of our seminar on Soren Kierkegaard's works of love. I've got a new computer, and I am recording from an undisclosed location, deep beneath a mountain, a bunker somewhere. Bob's going to be leading us today. I'm very close to finally finishing up the the Noetic audio version of the King James Bible. So you can go and check that out. My voice is pretty shredded, and my attention has been on that. So Bob's going to do most of the talking today, but I'm sure I'm going to have some questions along the way. So why don't you take it away, Bob?
Okay. We're going to kind of continue with the same theme about love is the fulfilling of the law. And it's, depending upon what book you have, it begins again on page 132. And as I was reading this, I was thinking the phrase, love is the fulfilling of the law, can be taken two different ways. When I studied Greek, I kind of learned this idea of the subjective and the objective way to read a sentence like this. So does he mean that if we love, we fulfill the law? Or does he mean that if we fulfill the law, that we truly love? So it's two different ways to take this. So one might consider one a more legalistic way to say that, well, if you want to truly love, you have to live according to the law. Another one might say it's more a romantic way of looking at the law. In other words, if you have love for everybody, you fulfill the law. So there's kind of two different ways to take that statement. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because it's an example of what Kierkegaard says is almost an endless project of trying to define the law. I mean, there's so many different ways you can take the law to what it means. Even his own statement, you can look at it, interpret it differently. He says it has a demand for both inwardness and perseverance. And that's kind of what we're going to discuss today. Both inwardness and perseverance. So let's begin with inwardness. He says the human concept of love also requires inwardness, devotedness, sacrifice, but defines it in a human manner. So he's differentiating between human love and between Christian love more directly. So he says in the human way of loving, we have inwardness, devotedness, and sacrifice, which is really not different from the Christian form of love. But the focus of the human concept is how the beloved reacts to these qualities. We tend to change ourselves to please our beloved. So it's the beloved who becomes the central focus of the love relationship. So when we establish a human love relationship, it's based upon the reaction of one and the other. And so we conform ourselves to be more pleasing, to establish a better love relationship with our object of our love. Here, inwardness must not be fully defined by its love relationship, but by its God relationship. So for the Christian, we can't define inwardness. And this is all a little vague right now, I understand, but we're gonna deal with what inwardness is and so forth. But he says that inwardness isn't really based upon the love relationship as something exclusive, but it's based upon the God relationship. It begins with self-renunciation, defined by one's helping the beloved to love God. That was a very critical statement. It begins with self-renunciation, defined by one's helping the beloved to love God. One cannot really help another to God if they're not willing to look beyond the present condition of the beloved. So it's not so much that we place the beloved higher, but that we place ourselves lower in the sense of mission. So we don't want to place the other person higher in the sense that they're nearer to God or closer to God or spiritually better. But it's a sense of humility of our mission. In other words, when we have a mission, the mission that we have is always greater than who we are. So we want to make sure that we don't confuse the two and place too much importance on the beloved. It's more the mission is important, which includes helping the beloved to God. The sacrifice of love, now he speaks about, cannot require any reward. If it's a sacrifice, you can't equate sacrifice to a reward, at least directly. It must be done without any expectation of a reward. The human type of love only requires that it be loved in return. And so for the human, we love somebody, but we love them. There's kind of an understood condition that we're going to love them, and hopefully the expectation or the reward of that love is to be loved back again. And this is a kind of reward in a sense. Now, if it doesn't happen, well, then it causes a distorted relationship. Then either the person tries either too hard, or they give up too much, or they sacrifice too much, trying to create that obligation on the part of the beloved that might not be there. So if we can't have a natural love back from our beloved, we create more of an unnatural response. Now, on the other hand, in Christian love, the inwardness is willing to be hated by the beloved. This seems to be the issue that Kierkegaard is telling us that separates Christian love from human love, in that the human wants love in return, but the Christian has to expect to be hated in return. And there's no reward that we should consider in a ministry, not even to be loved by the beloved. Especially, one might not say that's a ministry, so maybe I shouldn't use that term. But when we have a beloved, whoever that beloved is, our sacrifice in order to help our beloved to get closer to God, or to get to God in the first place, can't have a reward. We can't be doing it for some other reason. It has to be, the reason itself has to be the love for the beloved, to unite them with God. The person, therefore, belongs wholly to God in this God relationship. There's no room for ego or selfishness of any of this kind of love. In the human version, the sacrifice and self-denial always expect something in return, to be understood in order that the sacrifices and self-denials are recognized and rejoiced over. So we want others to know how much we're sacrificing. We keep a mental record, in a sense, sometimes, of all the good things that we do and that we're doing for our beloved in case we need to bring them up in the future. So it's kind of like an account that we have where we mentally note, and this happens really all the time, that we kind of mentally note what we've done for our beloved. So just in case just in case something happens, we need to be able to bring this up and say, but I've done this for you, now you owe me, you're obligated to me. And it just comes up naturally because of this type of a human love relationship that calculates, even unconsciously, calculates what we're owed by our beloved. And that's the human aspect. But in the divine aspect, the eternal aspect, or the Christian aspect, there's no such accounting that we do. We don't say, well, I brought you to God, so you owe me for this. If you do that, then you've just erased any reward that God intended to give you. So, like I think you even mentioned before, that's the reward in itself. To bring somebody to Christ is the reward within itself. There is nothing beyond that.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. There's a little bit of a disintegration on my end while you were talking earlier, and hopefully it's just the bad internet connection at my bunker. If not, we'll fix it later. So, I've got the fear of God in me right now.
Okay.
Like in a major way. And there's a lot of things I think that are going on within my psychology, and I'll just be honest, I'll just confess them right now. There's a lot of self-denial going on as a result of clinging to God so much. There's a lot of editing of my life, restructuring of my life. And I've been studying a lot of eschatology, and I'd be lying to you if I said there wasn't some sort of calculation of like, oh man, like on an eternal perspective, like I am thinking about what I am going to get in return as a result of this God relationship, whether it's simply to be in eternity or to, if you believe in there being higher and lower ranks within that eternity. I'm not even sure, but I'm just like, oh man, I really hope God thinks I'm doing good work right now. I've never really thought like that before. I think in some of the conversations that if people go back into the archive, some of the people would look at some of the conversation that we had, I shared more of this view of like, it doesn't really matter what happens to my eternal destination. The temporal reward of loving God is enough. But I find my psychology shifting as I fear God more. So am I failing or passing this litmus test that Kierkegaard's putting out there? Do you know what I'm talking about? Am I thinking about religion all wrong or Christianity all wrong?
No, I think that we go through many stages. Now, he talks about stages of life, but I think in Christianity we go through stages too. I think there's times that where we fear hell and we want heaven, and that's really what our drive is based upon. And Jesus even uses that to create that fear, to motivate believers to say, you better believe now and you better start today. So there is a certain motivation, I think, with the ideas of the extremes. I think, and again, this is just me speaking here from my own experience, I think the more mature we get, I think it becomes less important because our trust in God becomes so great that we know He'll do the right thing. And I try to remember who it was. I think it was Calvin who said that even if God sends me to hell, I know He's doing the right thing, and that gives me satisfaction. To know that God will make the right choice. Wherever I go, whatever happens to me, I can still rejoice in it because I know it's God's will. So we get to that kind of point of maturity that we say, look, I'm doing what God wants me to do, and I'm not doing it to go to heaven. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing it because I have such a high relationship with God, a high respect for God. I do it out of respect for God, out of love for God. I don't do it for the reward. But that may not always have been the case. So we go through these stages until we realize that, until our love and our faith in God becomes so great that it overwhelms us with trust and faith. That those other things, hell, heaven, how close we get to God, how much we're going to get in heaven, what our reward will be, just kind of becomes diminished. It's no longer important.
Another issue tied to this is, and I think it's summed up a little bit in what you said about Calvin. And he was like, yeah, even if I go to hell, it's a reflection of God's justice, so I won't protest against it. I think fearing God can lead to an obsession with being perfect in God's eyes, which is hard, right? Because on the one hand, we have the blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ as sort of this covering atonement for us, and so in this very direct recognition that we can't do it on our own and that we can't be perfect. On the same hand, we have this issue of, well, if you become too comfortable in the trust that you have with Jesus Christ and grace or whatever, then you'll lapse and backslide into apostasy and sin, and you'll be sort of, indistinguishable from the common heathen. So I guess the question is how do we have trust in God, but not lose our desire for continued refinement and progress towards perfection?
Okay. That it depends upon. I faced that problem. That was a great issue for me.
Who doesn't?
What I concluded is the problem is with the question. It's what does the word perfection mean to us? Now, if we take it perfection to mean total, perfect righteousness on our own, then we'll never arrive at that, and nor should we arrive at that. That was what Jesus did. That was what we have faith in. We have faith in his perfection and his righteousness. But that doesn't mean that we have no responsibility. What it means is that we have to also strive to be perfect, but not perfect in righteousness, perfect in faith. Because if we're perfect in faith, then that brings us to perfection and righteousness through that faith in Christ's righteousness. So it's not that we're trying to become righteous, we're trying to become faithful. So my focus for the last number of years, since I've come to that conclusion, has been to have perfect faith. And God is going to, that means I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm going to learn from that how to have perfect faith. And so, for me, it's not a matter of sin and righteousness. It's a matter of faith and lack of faith, faith and little faith, like the disciples.
So if I understand correctly, faith is its own reward, because it releases us from this obsession with being perfect so that we don't get cast into a pit of fire, that there is some sort of alleviation, and we kind of get the best of both worlds. Not only do we get some sort of distinguishing of those afflictions about where our eternal destination is, but that actually is how we get to the eternal destination that we want to go to. Would that be the right way to say it?
Yeah, that's certainly that's one way to see that. That's one facet of it. The other is that righteousness is still an element of our life. To kind of help clarify that a little bit, we trust in Jesus, we believe in Jesus, we cast our faith upon Jesus. But what does that mean? Who was Jesus? That means that we cast ourselves upon his righteousness. So we have to love his righteousness. We can't just say, well, we're just going to let Jesus do it all and back to party time for us. No, then you're not loving Jesus. You got to understand who was Jesus. And my belief is he was, and probably nowhere else as compact as the Sermon on the Mount. We have to love the Sermon on the Mount. We have to want to be like the Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus. That's his character. That's who he was. And that's he's giving us that insight into his character. To say, if you love me, you will love what I say. If you love me, you'll love my sermon. So if we say, well, I love Jesus, but I can't, the Sermon on the Mount, can't buy it, then you really don't love Jesus. So that's the litmus test right there. What do we love? What do we have faith in? Who do we love? Who do we have faith in? So that's kind of how it comes together with righteousness.
Thank you.
Okay. So he continues on here. He says, we all want others to know how much we're sacrificing. Sometimes that's why we sacrifice. We want the world to see, look what I'm giving up. Like Jesus spoke about the Pharisees, and when they fasted, they wanted to make sure everybody knew they were fasting. They'd blow horns and trumpets and say, look at what I'm doing. I'm fasting, how holy I am. But the idea was, no. Wash your hair, comb your hair, make yourself look hungry. You don't have to show the world you're suffering. Do it in private. But some keep a mental record of all the good things that they do for their beloved, in case we need to bring them up in the future. Sometimes we think of all the good things we do for our spouses, and we kind of keep a little mental note. Write it down a little someplace, because you never know when you need to bring that up again to show them Well, this is what I've done for you. What have you done for me? So we have to be careful that we don't keep those mental notes, those mental records. You do it and you forget about it. It comes under the idea of whatever your right hand does, don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. So sacrifice, in that case, becomes something of an appearance. It looks like someone is forsaking the world, he says, but it's really one who remains within the world. Sacrifice becomes a kind of badge or a cross for others to see. So Kierkegaard is telling us that that's not the kind of sacrifice that the Christian is supposed to be doing. That's the kind of sacrifice people in the world do. I want you to see what I'm doing. I want you to take notes, and I want, because I'm expecting to get credit for this. But he says the Christian sacrifice appears to the world as madness. In Christianity, the one who sacrifices knows that he truly has no merit before God, which is a lot what you were saying. We come to this place before God when we know there's no way we can live up to God's righteousness. And our sacrifice, no matter what we do, has absolutely no merit. What can we give God that God can't, that God doesn't have? It's not like we can get him a surprise gift or something. Whatever we get God, he already knows about it, and he's already got 1 million of them. So there's nothing we can do for God that deserves any merit. And that's what the insanity, that's what appears to the world as insanity. The kind of God they want is the kind of God that you can work for, you can perform something for. But he says that this is truly Christian love. What appears to be the greatest love and happiness is really the heaviest suffering if it were not for its relationship with God. So what the Christian does, and the example that comes to mind is when in the first century, and second, a little bit later than that, when Christians were being martyred. It was a sacrifice they gave of themselves. And it appeared madness to the world. Why would you sacrifice yourself? I've even met Christians and Christian pastors who say, why would you do that? You could do a lot more good in the world. So don't offer don't let people sacrifice you. You could do a lot more good here in the world. That's stupid. That's madness to let people offer you as a sacrifice. But what Kierkegaard is doing is defending it. And he's saying, no, that's not madness. He said, that's the greatest love you can do, is to offer yourself for God.
Yeah, well, and I've gone through that shift in understanding of reality. I remember looking at when the Ebola virus broke out in Africa a couple years ago, and a bunch of doctors from Atlanta went to do medical missionary work. I was like, this is utterly insane that you would put yourself in proximity to this virus. But now I can understand the mentality of,
sacrifice.
Of sacrifice, and it's worth exploring to some degree. But in some way, it's an utter demonstration of the faith relationship that you have, and it really comes down to how much ought humans to imitate Christ, right? I guess some people would say, well, individuals who put themselves in such harm's way have some sort of Messiah complex. It might be worth addressing. I wanted to share a quote here that talked about righteousness, and I think you were alluding to it earlier, but it's Isaiah 64:6. And I know you know it, just for the audience at home, if they're not familiar with this. And this is the NIV version. All of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. We all shrivel up like a leaf, and like the wind, our sins sweep us away. Just talking about the idea of all our sacrifice and all our righteousness is inconsequential in the eyes of God, considering what He has power over. I think it. Is it really madness? Is it really madness to sacrifice yourself for your neighbor? And even if that means flying across halfway across the world to find your neighbor, there's something that when you really fear and love God, when you've really worked out your salvation with fear and trembling, as Kierkegaard has and wants us to do. In a lot of ways, that becomes a very rational thing, doesn't it? Can you see, maybe, can we, like, or does it not? I mean, what do you think? Because I can see, like, you don't want to end up like Peter, not live, denying Christ in some way. I mean, you want to be in a way where your whole life is this complete affirmation of the gift that Christ gave to you and a reflection of it. So it would seem only natural to, in the mental state that I have now, and maybe people think I'm sounding like a complete zealot, it seems like doing those extraordinary acts of humanity become rational on a level. What do you think about that?
No, that's absolutely right. I agree that each person is led differently by the Spirit of God.
Of course, we don't have to all sacrifice in the same way.
To stand and make judgment. But you said something interesting before. Martin Kempis wrote a book called, this is, I think, in the 13th century, 14th century, wrote a book called The Imitation of Christ, which is a very good read. It's certainly worthy of reading. But it develops an idea and sometimes a problem, imitation of Christ. Do we imitate him? Is that what we're supposed to do? Because that implies the separation, a distinction. There's Christ and there's me, and I'm just trying to imitate him. See? Or do we let Christ live through us, which is not an imitation. It's an authentic connection, an authentic relationship with God as Christ is in us, which is what the New Testament preaches. It really doesn't teach us to imitate him, but rather to let God live through us. And so that's become my focus. I got confused about that issue too, and I know other people might be confused. It's not that we're supposed to try to imitate Christ, but that through the faith, we let God live through us. And if that means that we have to leave here and go to the middle of Africa to help somebody, then so be it. That's what we do. But if we're doing it just as an imitation, then I'm not sure that we really have that right connection yet. So that's the one thing that each of us as an individual has to kind of wrestle with and say, am I imitating Christ or am I letting Christ live through me?
Yeah. Well, I think wouldn't part of the litmus test be how much calculation is involved in it, right? I mean, obviously there has to be calculation in every sort of major life decision, but at least I found if the Holy Spirit is truly dwelling in you, I don't think you really think about it too much when your fellow man calls out in a time of need.
It's an irresistible urge, an irresistible calling, and each of us becomes more and more familiar with it. I don't think any one of us has it worked out perfectly, but it's something that we continue to learn how God calls us and works with us. Yeah, but you're absolutely right about that.
It's really a remarkable thing. I was telling Bob about it earlier off camera, and I feel like you shared. I mean, what's very interesting is in the New Testament, Jesus frequently, and even with Moses, right, in the Old Testament, Moses wasn't exactly a great orator. I think he was slow of speech, it is said, but in both cases, God or the Holy Spirit just says, don't worry, you'll find the words by me being within you or being behind you or backing you up in some way. And the more I try to live out the Christian perspective, the more I'm finding that is very true, is that I don't want to say like I'm like being possessed by the Holy Spirit or something like that, but it is quite amazing what one can summon up in the moment as a result of that relationship. And I don't know if Bob wants to add anything to that in his own experiences.
Yeah, no, those are, like I say, those are things that we learn as a Christian. We learn to make a distinction between our will and God's will. Even our humanitarian will. I mean, all of us have to be a piece of being a humanitarian in us. That's not exactly the same thing. You know, we may want to devote ourselves to a certain situation, and, you know, we have to follow that too. But I think as we become more and more mature, we can make the distinction between who I am as a humanitarian and who I am as a Christian. And that's a life, that's how, what would we call it? That just continues on throughout our whole life experience. I mean, I don't have that nailed down yet, so I don't know if anybody does. But
oh man, you're sounding a lot like me, Bob. A lot of people are turning to me. They want me to answer all their questions, and I'm like, I don't know. I can't know everything. and when I ask you questions, you're like, yeah, I don't have all the answers. I don't have that figured out for myself.
I'm confirming your hypothesis here.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to see it's nice to see someone else squirm.
I'm glad I can help out where I can.
All right, I'll let you go back.
Now we're on to perseverance. Okay, perseverance occurs in both Christian and human love. What it means in Christian love is that the same inwardness must be maintained throughout the duration of time. So it's an inwardness, but now Kierkegaard is seeing it's got something added to it, duration of time. So duration of time becomes a factor that changes mere inwardness into perseverance. When you think that you've loved enough, he says, when you think you've loved enough, and it's the other person's turn to love, you find your love is now even more demanded of you. And this is what he's trying to build up is this idea of perseverance. So just when you think that, okay, I've loved you as much as I can, now it's my turn to sit back and be loved, he says, that's not how perseverance works. Now you really start to love the other person. That's what perseverance is. And this brings out that sacrificial quality that he's talking about. And this is perseverance, to love beyond what you expect to love. It demands of you both more love in depth as well as length. When we're in self-renunciation and we have to bring a sacrifice, it's the hardest sacrifice. This is to receive the reward of hatred for our love from the object of our love. That's hard. If you have an object of love, a person, and you love that person, if you love them so much that you want to bring them to God or help their relationship with God, you have to be willing to accept the idea that it may create hatred, at least at first. There may be a hatred involved because of what you're trying to do. And I guess this might be seen, let's say you have a mixed marriage or a mixed relationship between a Christian and between someone of another religion, and you want to bring that other person to Christianity. It may create hatred between the person that you actually love. But you love that person so much you want to bring them to Christ. But the more you try, the more hatred you create. I mean, that's just one example that comes to mind. And seeing there's no relief from this state. And then I ask, well, why would someone hate us for bringing them to God? Perhaps because of the demands that it makes upon the other. Perhaps for the same reason that they hated Jesus, his demand for truth and love. To tell a person, even a beloved, that you have to see yourself as you really are. You have to really see yourself as you stand before God. It's not a very comfortable position to be in, right, Luke? But in the end, you know, and that person, that may create hatred from the other person to you for showing them who they really are.
Can I ask you a question about that? I know I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's why we do this.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of people who have these questions, and from what I understand, people feel like they don't have anyone to talk to about these. So I think it's helpful. I'm sure I'm reflective of what some of the questions people have. How do we do this tightrope dance between loving people so much that we want to bring knowledge of God and foment that God relationship with them, and spending so much time on certain individuals that we neglect our own God relationship or helping other individuals? The Bible seems to speak in a dual way about this, right? On the one hand, there's this, I don't want to say command, but this urging to spread the gospel, but at the same time, we're not to be unequally yoked, and to, I hate to say it because I know it'll sound un-PC to the modern ears, but it tells us not to take up with strange men and women and things of this nature. So how do we balance this call to share the gospel with keeping within our religious communities as the Bible seems to instruct us? So what would you say to someone who says, I can't reconcile these two themes?
Well, I think that in one theme, Jesus sends his disciples out 2 by 2. Tells them, don't take money, gold with you. Don't take even your staff with you. Just go out 2 by 2 and bring the gospel to the people. And if they reject it, then take your sandals off, shake the dust off, and leave. And I think that implies the more casual relationship that we have with people. And people say, well, that's interesting. You're a Christian. Tell me more. Then we stay and we explain. But if they tell us, I don't want to hear it, it's blasphemous to me, I don't want to hear about it, then we go on to spread to somebody else. So that's kind of more the casual relationship that we have with people. But if we meet somebody that we love and we're married and we enter into a marriage with them, and let's say it's an unequal marriage in the sense that one's a Christian, one is not, it does create a problem. But that's the situation where we need to be that we need to use what he calls endurance. That's where we need to be patient with them. We need to expect to be hated by them. But we have a higher goal, and we try it as long as we possibly can. If it still doesn't work, Paul tells us that we may need to split.
So if I understand this correctly, with individuals that we may have a passing acquaintanceship with, or a passing relationship, it's enough to plant the seed. And, sometimes it falls on rich soil and sometimes it's hostile soil. And then we just keep spreading more seeds. But if it's someone that we're yoked with, either as a result of a professional commitment or a family commitment or a romantic commitment or a platonic commitment, then it wouldn't be unwise from a Christian perspective to go the extra mile for them.
Right. Now look at Jesus. Jesus gives us the example. When he ran into Pharisees who didn't agree, who didn't believe, he didn't say, okay, let's sit down here in my ministry. I'm going to put my ministry on hold, the crucifixion, all that on hold. Let's sit down and let's have a debate here. And I'm not going to leave until I answer all your questions. That wasn't the technique that Jesus himself used. He planted the seeds, just as you said. He said what he had to say, then moved on because he had a mission. And so, to me, that teaches me we have to discover our mission. And we cannot become distracted from that mission. And we can't let one person or even a small group of people take over our mission and distract us from that. We have to give them what we have. And as Paul says, maybe we're going to plant the seed and somebody's going to come behind and water it. And somebody fertilize it, and then somebody reap it. So we have to just play our part in that and pray for those people. But sometimes that's all we can do. Plant the seed and then pray and go on to somebody else. And that's something that, again, that comes under the idea of the urgency of the Holy Spirit and our understanding of our ministry and what that is.
Matthew, you did a great job answering that. I'll let you get back to it.
Oh, okay. So it says that this is a difficulty and that one must always struggle to love, receiving no reward other than hatred, and this is endurance. The Spirit begins with the moment of resolution, intention, and promise. As we struggle in self-renunciation, we hope to find victory, but we can only see our victory as an impossibility. So it says our goal never seems to be visible. And many times we never see the result or finishing of our love for another. And I think that involves pretty much what you asked as far as the question. We may never see our love fulfilled in that individual. But that's not our mission. Our mission is to see God's love fulfilled in that individual, not our love. So even in our spouse, the idea is even if things don't work out and we just can't get along in this divergence of religion, that our hope is that God's love will be fulfilled even if ours is not. One of the most difficult things for man to deal with is time, he says. When we are in a state of struggle, time is an added stress. It makes us more aware of the struggle and its intensity. It requires more duration and therefore more endurance. And I think that's a pretty rational statement to say that when we're enduring difficult times, I think we become much more aware of time. It's like when we're in pain. If we're not in pain, we don't even think of it. The day passes so quickly. Say, wow, boy, the day just passed right by me, flew right by me. But if you're in agony and constant pain, days don't fly by. Time, you just feel every second, every moment of that day. And I think that's what he's trying to allude to here. And he says that this now, he gives us what appears almost to be like an isolated question. He said, when a person simply forgets about his guilt, does it really disappear? So if we've committed a sin or if we've done something wrong, and then we forget about it, we get distracted from it, we go on in life, and it becomes just a distant memory, if even a memory, does that erase it? Is it no longer effective? Does it no longer affect us? Let me throw that on you. What do you think? Do you think that if we forget about a sin, that it doesn't count anymore? Or
it depends on the magnitude of the sin, right? I think there are things that each one of us, despite how hard we may try to forget them, we can't. We may be only temporarily able to put it out of our mind. But then I presumably there would be sort of small sins that I think many of us would be able to move on from. But I guess the whole thing about sin consciousness is whether or not it's actually a cognitive activity at all, or if it's just something that kind of just like amalgamates like over the years, and we feel the burden of it, and we may not be able to recognize this, we may not be able to understand what's pulling on us or weighing down on us in terms of which, what the ratio of small sins to big sins and how much they're cognitively processed or not. I do think they can add up to the point where we find ourselves on our knees and repenting. So the question is, does it matter, or what? I mean, I hope I'm answering the question correctly. I mean,
no, it's just a provocative question.
From our own perspective, I think ultimately it will catch up with us, and I can't imagine that God would forget. So even if we forget, God is a great recorder of the past.
Yeah.
It is held firmly in his mind, every aspect of it. So even if we have forgotten some things, I think when we stand before him, and I think he'll be able to pull up the file pretty all right.
Okay. Well, I'll give you my version of that answer too.
Sure.
But I'm going to read Kierkegaard's kind of response to it. He says, so time changes how we see things. It can sometimes soften how we see our past sins, but no amount of time can change the requirement of love being the fulfilling of the law. Neither can it change the sin and the results upon the world. So I think sometimes of some careless things I've said to people when I was younger, much younger. And I think that careless thing could have really hurt somebody. We don't know the effects of the things that we've done. And you called small sins, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because is there a small sin? I mean, if you say something just at the wrong time when somebody's so vulnerable, and then it hurts them so much,
Yeah.
and it may seem small to us, but it certainly doesn't seem small to the person who heard it. And that sin reverberates because now that person is hurt, and they may pass that on to somebody else and pass it on to somebody else. So sometimes the small sin that we consider small has an effect, a geometrical effect on the world.
Yeah.
So we never know. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and I think sins that we would consider to be small, as we mature, we can start to see that they were much larger when we can get outside of ourselves and have that sort of geometric perspective like you're talking about. I had an event, where I don't know how much I can talk about the particulars of it, but like you're saying, you never know just what you're contributing to or not contributing. So this raises a larger question about whether or not there is an actual division about small and large sins.
Right.
It seems that they have shifting priorities over time for us. I mean, and this goes back to a more interesting theological question about the equality of sin. And if that's really the case, I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, in a way, I think we think that all sin is equal, right? Because if you just made one little sin, like, you are separated from God and in need of Jesus Christ, right? But the way that we talk about sin, we typically talk about it in terms of a moral situation where we're like, well, at least I didn't kill anybody. Honestly, I'm not Hitler. Like, but does that? God, I should have brought Hitler into the conversation because it would just make it explosive. But you know what I'm saying? Like, we talk in moral terms all the time as there being some sort of graduation of sins, but then we talk about from a theological perspective how there's total equality of sins, and then we have these whole ideas of like sins that don't really seem like sins, like lusting after someone but not acting on it, or like thinking an evil thought about someone but never doing anything to them, and that having the same degree of sinfulness as adultery and murder is kind of a hard idea to get your mind around. But I mean, that's what the Bible teaches.
Yes, it does. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus tells us, he said, even if you have a lustful thought, you're already guilty of adultery.
Yeah, I'm going to hell. I'm going to hell. Oh man.
Okay, well, we'll need to have some more talks then. Okay, then we start section 3b, called "Love is a Matter of Conscience." So I'm going to read that. This is kind of an interesting perspective that Kierkegaard has on it. So he introduces it from a quote from 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. The aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and sincere faith. So that's what we're going to talk about, conscience. The victory that Christianity aims at is not the love of novelty. It doesn't want to conquer in a worldly way. What Christian love does is make every human relation between man and man a relationship of conscience. Aha. Very interesting here. He's kind of shifting it over here to say, what's the element of love that makes it Christian? Well, we'll spend a little time talking about conscience here. Our love does not try to find a place in this world as though it needed to be accepted by the world. It takes no position in the world, yet it has changed everything. It penetrates everything. Now, that's a pretty profound statement, that Christian love is not meant to change the world. Yet, it changes everything because it penetrates everything. That's a good thought to ponder here, and we will ponder it as we go through here. He says our faith in Christ is not something that should be altered by the world, but rather it should alter the world. That's my 2 cents there. That our faith in Christ, remember, is something that is supposed to alter the world by permeating the world, penetrating into the world. It should not be changed or altered by the world. So the church is responsible for this penetration of the Word of God into the world to change everything. It's not supposed to be changed by the world. So it has to stand on its foundation, which Christ talked about, that foundation on rock rather than the foundation of sand. When Christian love changes, what Christian love changes is not external and visible, but it's the infinite. So we have Christian love reaches out differently. It doesn't try to be external and visible. It shouldn't try to be external and visible. It should be more in the infinite world, in the invisible world, in order to permeate, to penetrate into the depths of a person. That's where the change takes place, in the depths of the human soul and heart. It's like the Christian had some kind of, he says this, it's like the Christian had some kind of divine fluid in his arteries instead of blood. It wants to breathe eternal life, the divine, into the human race. This is why they are called a nation of priests. The true love of a Christian is to bring the gospel to everyone, which is to bring everyone into a relationship with God. So Christian love doesn't want to change the externalities, the external person, to make them look differently, really. What it wants to do is change the internal parts of an individual. It wants to reach down into the soul and the heart and the spirit to make those changes. He talks now an example. This is kind of a little difficult example to follow here. Sometimes his examples tend to be like that. About the scrub woman, about a lowly scrub woman. That she has the right to say that she works for her conscience sake. He tells us that the only one, however, in the secular world who works for conscience alone is the king. I'm not quite sure exactly at this point why he says that, but let's just pursue a little bit further. So the king is the only one who can say, I work for conscience sake. But yet, this woman becomes somehow equal to the king when she works for conscience sake. So he's making a comparison, which he does a lot of times, of the extremes. You've got a lowly scrub woman and you've got the king. And both are claiming that they work for conscience sake. So they both become equal in that category. If no one listens to her and she cares about this factor, then she's not of a Christian mind. In other words, the Christian must forsake such self-consciousness for the sake of something higher. So we may be conscious of what we're doing. We may do it for our conscience sake, but it's not something that we should keep in mind. We shouldn't do it for the sake of others. Now we discuss the idea, at least he's going to discuss the idea of secrets when it comes to telling others about inwardness. And this is hopefully going to explain a little bit more about this little story that he tells between the king and the scrub woman here. So it has to do with telling secrets to others about our inwardness. When we try sometimes to discuss our inwardness, it makes no sense to others. It becomes meaningless. I'm sure you've experienced that, Luke. If you sit down and think that I can, pour my heart out to this individual, I can talk about my inner feelings to somebody, and you get just kind of a weird look back, like, man, I don't know what you're talking about. That's, I think, what Kierkegaard is saying. That sometimes when we try to reach down and discuss our inwardness with other people, it just doesn't mean anything to them because they don't have the same context. They don't have the same feelings that go along with that inwardness.
I think a question that's always that's interesting to me is you share your testimonial to individuals, is how it becomes more than just a mere sort of emotional blathering, how it can offer itself as an access point for someone who may be closed off to religious belief, to say, hey, maybe I should explore this for myself as well. And maybe it's just as simple as the authenticity of the expression of it. I think what a lot of those testimonials, what can seem kind of hollow about a lot of those testimonials is they seem so overwrought and forced, and something that's put on display and
rehearsed.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. What will the testimonial conserve in the spreading of the gospel, and how to make it really resonate with certain individuals? And of course, everybody's testimony is going to be quite different. So many of us, it's not like we all came to Christ in the same way. I came at it through an academic, philosophical perspective, and then ultimately getting deep into technology and sort of prognosticating technology futures, and that was my way to it. But for other people, it's a lost love affair. It can be drug abuse. It can be the untimely death of a father figure. It can be so many things. So it's just an interesting question about how testimonials offer a foothold for people. I don't know if you have anything profound to say about that. I find it to be sort of interesting, as I go around sharing my message with people, or sharing the message about my own story with people.
I see it in two parts, and it is a controversial issue. I think that, biblically speaking, 1 John, I think it is, and in other places, testimony is the best way, in a sense, to spread the gospel. What did it do for me? That's something you can't really argue. This is what it's done for me. It takes it out of the realm of the intellectual. It says, if you want the same thing that I experienced, this is how you can do it. And this gives it meaning, and it gives it truth. What you're talking about. The gospel is now no longer something intellectually apart from me. It becomes who I am. So it's so important. Testimony is so very important. But on the other hand, testimony has been abused. Testimony in some places that I've been has become competitive. My testimony is more powerful than your testimony. And so there becomes competition, and people begin to add to it, and they begin to make it something that it really wasn't, for the sake of dressing it, making it more meaningful, because they see the power of testimony, so they try to dress it up a little bit. And then we get on the verge of deception at that point. So I am all for testimony, but we as Christians have to be careful and really tell the testimony, not try to sell it, but just tell it, don't sell it. Now I sound like a minister, don't I? Tell it, don't sell it. Anyway, but that's...
You just sold me on your maxim for testimonials. Very, very, very slick presentation there, Bob.
Thank you, sir. Now, he says, one such secret that he talks about is the divine meaning. Do not busy yourself with changing the shape of the world or your condition of life, as if you who are a scrub woman could become a woman of importance, a madam, let's say. And this is kind of interesting. So he's saying here that the secret meaning might be the woman is thinking that maybe I can change my importance here by becoming, instead of a scrub woman, maybe people will look at me more highly as a madam if I sell my testimony incorrectly. Now, Paul talks about this. When I read that, it kind of resonated with me, and I says, wait a second, I remember something 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 20 to 24, he says, let each one remain in that situation in life in which he was called. Were you as a slave, called as a slave? Do not worry about it. But if indeed you are able to be free, make the most of the opportunity. For the one who is called in the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freedman. In the same way, the one who is called as a free person is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. In whatever situation someone was called, brothers and sisters, let him remain in it with God. So Paul is encouraging us and saying, look, maybe you were a slave when God called you. Don't struggle and say, well, I can't be a good Christian unless I'm free, so I have to become free. And on the other hand, even if you are free, you really aren't free. You're a slave of Christ. So what he's saying is don't struggle in the externals, and how valuable you're going to be in the external world. You don't have to change the external world. The internal world is being changed by you. So like example here, Paul might be saying, if you're a slave, spread the gospel to other slaves. You have a mission. You have a ministry. You just got to open your eyes. You don't have to be free to reach people outside. You can reach other slaves, other servants.
Yes. Well, what's interesting is that this is a really profound passage, but it's also one that causes people a lot of problems, right?
Yeah.
This passage from Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, a lot of people cite this as ways to stultify any sort of progress towards political equality that we have within our society. Now, I don't think it necessarily entails that. I think, right, if you're in your position spreading the gospel, I think ultimately you change hearts and then you get that political equality that you were seeking all along. But what would you say to someone who is just like, man, this pretty much just affirms like this oppressive order and encourages people to stagnate and not fight for their rights? What would you say about that?
Well, I think we're forgetting God's role in things. I think that God knows what's going on. God knows not only what's going on politically, but individually. He knows our role. He knows the situation that we're in, and there has to be an amount of trust with him. There has to be that connection with God. And Kierkegaard actually gets into that question. I'll try to answer it a little bit now, though. I think that we can be so easily distracted from our mission, kinds of desires of equality, of freedom, etc., etc. We can become very distracted from the mission that God intends us to have. So most importantly, it's not about my mission to be free or to be equal or to be whatever. It's about God's mission that I have to live. So above everything else, I have to discover that and live in that and then fight my way through it. But we'll see what Kierkegaard does, because he talks exactly about that, about equality. So I'm sure you probably were thinking about that when you raised the question. The Christian must not seek those kinds of changes. She must seek the world quietly and easily so that no one notices it or her. In other words, get rid of the ego. It changes the world in such a way by making every man, in a sense, a king. Every man becomes able to make choices of conscience. We may not rule in the state of conscience, but we obey in such a state. In this state, everything is changed. So conscience is important. But you may not be a king and rule in the state of conscience, but you can obey in the state of conscience. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to be a king. You can still be a servant woman and have the same place, have that equality. In the world, even little changes come with great clamor, especially when we're trying to make ourselves important. Right? I'm sure you experienced that where you live in the political arena. If anybody makes a little change, or they want it to be publicized, everybody has to know about this little tiny change I've made so I can get recognition for it. But Christianity changes the infinite in all stillness, like nothing. It does this by inwardness. Kierkegaard is so amazing. He was able to understand this and to write about this, to be able to clearly write about this. This is the power of Christianity. The inner being, the inwardness, the heart, the soul, not forcibly persuading people, even through argumentation. It's through the soul, through the heart, and through the mind that we reach people. Those are the changes that God is interested in. Those are the changes that Kierkegaard says the Christian should be interested in. Christianity changes the infinite in all stillness like nothing. It does this by inwardness. So inwardness is the change that takes place in the thinking, believing, and the living of people. It changes them from the inside rather than merely externally. It changes through conscience. It brings the relationship of love. So now he's making the connection between conscience and between love. And I think we could probably leave it there for today and pick it up next week.
I was just scrolling through your notes. I was like, wow, Bob really prepared for this. So we're probably going to need to spend Friday probably not.
I got to save something for Friday.
Yeah, I was hoping to get back into the teaching, but I think it seems like you might have enough to carry us through Friday as well. So maybe I'll pick it up again on Tuesday or whatever. It's okay. We'll get it all done when it needs to get done. I hope you don't mind me asking all the questions I did, but I think I get a sense that a lot of people have the questions that I'm asking you. So
it's good for me too. I mean, I want you to understand that. Sometimes it seems like I have the answers, but a lot of times the answers come to me on the moment. And I'm just as surprised as you are.
Well, I haven't consulted with anyone yet because I've been in the session with you, but I imagine there are many people who are very appreciative that you were able to address those concerns. Because, like I said, these are a lot of the questions I'm asking you. Some of them are mine, but some of them are ones that I've gathered up in my efforts to be a good testimony to Christianity. So I want to thank Bob again for leading our discussion today. I found it, I'm glad we got back into it, Bob. I missed talking to you for the past week and a half or so, and I'm glad we're back into it and that we can focus our efforts on finishing this book now. So download the Noetic app. I've got so much coming in terms of development on that. You guys are going to see a bunch of upgrades very soon, and I appreciate all of you helping to build this community with us. All right, Bob, have a good evening, my friend.
Okay, blessings to all.
All right.